It was a routine night on the political calendar, the kind of live town hall event that fills cable news time slots and social media feeds alike. Former President Donald Trump was one of the featured guests, seated in his usual commanding posture, leaning slightly forward as if always ready to pounce. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her sharp legal mind and direct manner of speaking. The tone of the evening was expected to be tense but civil. That's how these things are usually framed to opposing forces sitting across from each other, trying to outwit, outtalk, or outlast the other in front of a national audience. The moderator had just tossed a broad question about leadership and moral character into the mix, one of those questions that sounds neutral but has the potential to veer into highly personal territory. Crockett took a brief pause, adjusting her posture and choosing her words carefully. She didn't rush. She wasn't there to play to the gallery. When she spoke, her tone was level, without malice or condescension, but firm. She said that public service isn't just about policy. It's also about trust, about how the public looks to elected officials, not just for solutions, but for consistency between words and actions. Then, smoothly, almost casually, she pivoted. She began drawing a connection between political rhetoric and personal conduct, saying that when someone builds their brand on loyalty, faith, and traditional values, it's fair to ask how consistently they apply those ideals. She acknowledged that personal lives don't always mirror public images, and people make mistakes, but when those mistakes become patterns, especially in the highest office of the land, voters are right to raise questions. That's when she turned directly toward him, maintaining eye contact, and without raising her voice, delivered a line that shifted the energy in the room. She questioned how someone could run a campaign rooted in the idea of family values and loyalty while having a history marked by multiple marriages and public scandals related to personal behavior. It wasn't phrased to humiliate, nor was it an attempt to moralize. It was a political question wrapped in plain-spoken logic. If loyalty is a pillar of leadership, how is that reflected in one's own life? The moment landed with an audible stillness. Not dramatic, not gasping, but still. A pause long enough to suggest the audience was processing the weight of what had just been said. Not because they hadn't heard these things before, but because they hadn't been said quite like this, in a setting like this, by someone like her. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he laughed, a kind of dismissive chuckle meant to signal control, to brush it off as irrelevant. He threw a short quip back in her direction, implying the comment was a cheap shot, a personal attack dressed up as political discourse. But Crockett remained still. She didn't react to the deflection. She didn't take the bait or pivot to something safer. Instead, she leaned in slightly and clarified her point. She emphasized that when leaders ask for trust, the public has a right to understand what kind of behavior that trust is built upon. She said that pointing out contradictions between personal actions and public promises isn't mudslinging, its accountability. There was no rise in her voice, no sarcastic tone, just a straightforward challenge that could not be easily laughed away. At that moment, the former president looked noticeably less comfortable. He shifted in his seat. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for close watchers to see that her question had touched a nerve. Maybe it was the precision, maybe it was the calmness, but for someone who had long dominated televised exchanges through volume and unpredictability, this kind of quiet firmness was difficult to counter. The audience picked up on it too. Murmurs began, not in outrage, but in reflection. Some viewers nodded, others looked at their phones, already starting to tweet, and behind the scenes, producers probably realized they had just witnessed the defining moment of the night, an unforced, unscripted exchange that would ripple long after the camera stopped rolling. As the room settled into an uneasy silence following Jasmine Crockett's direct reference to Donald Trump's personal life, there was a noticeable pause. For a split second, it felt like even the cameras were waiting to see what would happen next. Trump, ever the media veteran, had been in hundreds of these moments, scrutinized, confronted, challenged. Normally, he would brush off a comment like that with ease, often deflecting with a joke, a pivot, or by turning the heat back on his opponent. But something about the way Crockett delivered her comment didn't give him that usual runway. He tried to recover quickly. A smile flickered on his face, then a scoff. He raised a hand in the air and said, "That's a low blow," clearly aiming to reframe her comment as out of bounds. "You Democrats always go personal when you've got nothing else." There were a few polite chuckles from the audience, but nothing close to a full recovery. It didn't feel like a triumphant rebuttal, it felt like a detour. He looked toward the moderator, perhaps hoping for a rescue question, but the moderator didn't step in. The format was open, and the stage was Crockett's as much as it was his. So, with no immediate relief, he did what he often does. He tried to turn the moment into a broader attack. He gestured toward Crockett, saying something about how liberals pretend to care about values, but really just want to score points. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to project ease, but his voice betrayed something sharper underneath defensiveness. Crockett, to her credit, didn't escalate. She didn't smile, didn't smirk. She just waited, keeping her hands folded, maintaining eye contact. The quiet confidence in her posture seemed to contrast even more with his increasingly animated tone, and it was this contrast that began to shift the crowd's perception. People noticed not just what was being said, but how it was being said. Trump's typical swagger started to edge toward irritation. He mentioned his popularity with certain voter blocs. He listed his accomplishments. He threw in a dig about the current administration, hoping to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. But even as he spoke, the previous comment still hung in the air. It hadn't been shouted. It hadn't even been repeated. Yet it lingered. What made the moment unusual wasn't that Trump was criticized. He's no stranger to that. It was that the crowd didn't fully respond the way he expected. His usual applause lines landed with less energy. His one-liners didn't trigger the wave of laughter or clapping that typically follows. Instead, the audience seemed split, some still supportive, others quietly reconsidering what they'd just heard. He brought up Melania briefly, saying she preferred to stay out of the spotlight, and that their relationship was none of the media's business. Again, there was no attack from Crockett in response. She didn't press, she didn't interrupt. She let him speak, and in doing so, allowed him to reveal more than he probably intended. The more he talked, the more apparent it became that the initial comment had gotten under his skin. In real-time social media was already buzzing, clips were being posted, headlines were being drafted. Analysts were already preparing to dissect the moment from every possible angle. But in the room itself, something was becoming evident. Trump wasn't in full control of the narrative, not this time. He was still speaking, but no longer driving the tone. He was reacting to a single, carefully delivered statement that put a crack in his usual armor. And that reaction was louder than anything Crockett had said. Crockett continued to keep her composure. She wasn't pressing him to explain his personal life in detail, but she wasn't retracting the point either. It had been made, and his response, or lack of an effective one, was doing the rest. What had started as a calm, pointed comment had become the focal point of the exchange. And not because it was sensational, but because it drew an defensive posture from a figure known for always staying on offense. As the exchange continued, it became increasingly clear that Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply trying to provoke Donald Trump. She was making a broader point, one that resonated well beyond the confines of the live event. Her demeanor remained steady, unshaken by the subtle jabs or rising volume from the other side of the stage. Trump, on the other hand, seemed noticeably thrown off balance, where he typically thrived in combative back and forths, often using humor, volume, or sheer unpredictability to take control. Here he was facing something he rarely encountered: quiet persistence. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes or cut him off. Instead, she maintained a posture of calm authority, which only served to heighten the contrast between her and Trump. Every time he tried to regain momentum by bringing up the economy, attacking Democrats, or pivoting to a border policy point, there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there earlier in the broadcast. His voice, usually so composed in its brashness, had begun to sharpen at the edges. He wasn't yelling, but he was leaning in more, pointing his finger a little too much, and speaking over the moderator more often than usual. These weren't major explosions, they were subtle cues. But for those watching closely, they revealed a shift in tone that was impossible to ignore. Crockett, in contrast, remained measured. When asked a follow-up question by the moderator about the role of personal conduct in public trust, she didn't launch into an attack. Instead, she said, "I think the public is tired of contradictions. They're tired of politicians saying one thing and living another. That's not personal, that's accountability." It was the kind of line that carried weight not because it was loud, but because it was true. The audience responded not with gasps, but with thoughtful nods and murmurs of agreement. Trump jumped in again, this time accusing her of disrespect. He said that Democrats had no business talking about values and that his personal life had nothing to do with the current challenges facing the country. But the more he insisted on changing the subject, the more obvious it became that the original comment had gotten to him. What Crockett had done, whether deliberately or instinctively, was flip the dynamic. Trump is known for setting the tone of any conversation he's in. He dominates with presence, loud, unpredictable, often confrontational. It's a style that has served him well, especially in unscripted environments where others struggle to keep up. But in this moment, it was his opponent's quiet restraint that was drawing attention. Even when Trump mocked her credentials, saying, "You've got no experience running anything but your mouth," Crockett didn't rise to it. She smiled faintly, looked to the moderator, and let the silence fill the space. That silence spoke volumes. It was more effective than any rebuttal she could have given, because it allowed the audience to take note of who was in control of their emotions and who wasn't. The cameras caught Trump's slight eye roll, the tightening of his jaw, the quick glances to his team off. These weren't major gestures, but they were enough to show that the tension was real. He was visibly frustrated that someone wasn't reacting the way opponents usually did, by getting flustered, retreating, or shouting back. Crockett was doing none of those things. She was, in her own way, disarming him without ever needing to raise her voice. At one point, when asked directly if she wanted to clarify her earlier remarks, she said, "I don't think there's anything to clarify. I think voters want truth, even if it's uncomfortable, especially when it comes from someone asking for their trust again." That statement landed harder than any accusation. It wasn't angry, it wasn't smug, it was factual, and because of that, it hit harder. Trump leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, but he didn't say anything in response right away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was telling. For a man known for always having the last word, he seemed unsure of how to proceed. Crockett's poise throughout. The segment didn't just help her stand out, it highlighted how quickly someone like Trump could be thrown off not by rage, but by restraint. The moment between Jasmine Crockett and Donald Trump had already begun to echo beyond the boundaries of the televised event. But it was what followed in the hours and days afterward that solidified its place in the broader political conversation. What had initially appeared to be just another sharp exchange between a former president and a sitting member of Congress quickly transformed into a flashpoint, one that lit up social media, sparked debate panels, and even triggered think pieces. From both sides of the aisle, clips of Crockett calmly questioning Trump's alignment with the very values he claimed to champion went viral almost instantly. What stood out wasn't just her words, it was the composure she maintained while delivering them, and the uncharacteristically rattled response it drew from him. Within minutes, political Twitter and cable news began dissecting the moment, not for its volume or its outrage, but because it had disrupted a pattern. Trump, usually the one creating viral soundbites, was now the subject of them in a way he didn't control. Many viewers saw in Crockett's restraint a kind of modern political maturity that contrasted sharply with Trump's performance. Her calm presence under pressure prompted commentary across networks, some praising her for not taking the bait, others noting how rare it is for someone to make Trump visibly uncomfortable without resorting to shouting or spectacle. And while the former president had faced criticism before, the way this unfolded live, unfiltered, and with him caught off guard, was different. Trump's base immediately moved to defend him, framing the exchange as an unfair personal attack. Some claimed Crockett was out of line for mentioning his marriage. Others tried to pivot the conversation, pointing to policy issues or suggesting it was just another attempt to discredit him. But those responses couldn't change the optics of the moment. A composed legislator, calmly challenging a former president on live television, and him reacting in a way that suggested it struck a nerve. Political commentators picked up on the shift, too. On the Sunday shows, the moment was replayed and analyzed from every angle. Some hosts questioned whether Trump's reaction would have been the same if the comment came from a male counterpart, while others asked why personal integrity and public image were suddenly off limits when brought up by someone with a calm tone rather than a hostile agenda. Beyond the pundits and spin, average viewers seemed to notice something simpler. They saw a candidate who had long boasted about strength and dominance suddenly appearing unsettled when asked to explain an inconsistency between his message and his behavior. They saw someone challenging him without anger or aggression, and that made the contrast even more striking. Voters and political observers alike began discussing a bigger question. Can someone who asks for unwavering loyalty truly lead by example if their own personal history tells a different story? Crockett didn't need to hammer the point repeatedly. Her decision to leave the remark standing, without doubling down or making it the centerpiece of her remarks, gave it more weight. It hung in the air not because of how loudly it was delivered, but because of how sincerely it was. The moment also gave rise to discussions about political tone. In a media landscape often dominated by yelling matches, viral insults, and performative outrage, Crockett's approach reminded many that substance, delivered with clarity, can still break through the noise, and more importantly, that sometimes the strongest statement is the one made without theatrics. Trump, meanwhile, seemed aware that the exchange had landed poorly for him. In the following days, he made indirect references to the town hall moment, during interviews and rallies, sometimes accusing Democrats of focusing on nonsense or tabloid stuff instead of real issues. But even those mentions served to keep the conversation alive, signaling that despite his efforts to move past it, the moment had lingered with him as well. By midweek, polls and commentary indicated that the public wasn't necessarily scandalized by the content of Crockett's remark. It was the reaction it provoked that stuck with them. For a man who prides himself on being unflappable, who often claims no one can get under his skin, the visible irritation and break in composure told a different story. And in an election cycle where authenticity, steadiness, and accountability are being closely watched, that story mattered. In the end, what transpired between Jasmine Crockett and Donald Trump during that live broadcast became more than just a moment of political sparring. It became a case study in contrast. Not contrast in ideology alone, but in temperament, delivery, and public perception. While Trump is known for his dominance in unscripted formats, often bending conversations to his will with bravado and sharp retorts, he encountered something markedly different that night. He came face to face with a challenger who didn't match his volume, but instead met him with poise, control, and precision. Crockett didn't attempt to embarrass him with theatrics or personal jabs for cheap applause. She raised a fair question, one grounded in the intersection between public trust and personal character. Her words were not exaggerated or accusatory. They were rooted in the simple idea that leaders should practice the values they promote. And while Trump tried to dismiss the remark as irrelevant or unfair, his reaction revealed that he understood its impact. For someone who rarely shows discomfort, his inability to fully regain control of the room was telling. More importantly, this moment offered viewers an example of how political discourse can be both sharp and civil, confrontational, yet respectful. It wasn't an argument won by shouting the loudest, but by standing firmly in calm confidence. In doing so, Crockett didn't just shift the momentum of that event, she reminded audiences that leadership is often most visible in restraint, and that sometimes, asking one clear, grounded question can say more than a dozen fiery statements. Trump, for all his experience, appeared unprepared for a challenge delivered so quietly yet so effectively. His legacy as a powerful communicator, someone who rarely yields ground, was briefly shaken not by a scandal or a slip, but by a moment of honest confrontation that reflected the doubts many voters already carry. For a man who has survived and even thrived through countless controversies, the real weight of that exchange wasn't in the content alone, it was in how visibly it unsettled him. In an age where much of the political theater is just that performance, the authenticity of this exchange stood out. It resonated because it felt unscripted, human, and real. Crockett didn't just speak to Trump, she spoke to a wider concern in the electorate. The need for consistency between message and behavior. And that message, however uncomfortable for some, is one that many Americans are increasingly demanding of their leaders. What remains clear is that the moment will not be easily forgotten, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it wasn't, and that, in today's climate, might be the most powerful kind of political